This episode of the Creep Street Podcast is brought to you by Martini Coffee Roasters. You know, people always look at me weird when I say I start off every morning with a big old martini. But then I set them straight, and I tell them I'm talking about Martini Coffee Roasters coffee. A delicious coffee made by the Martini family. They roast their coffee using a traditional method of sight and sound to roast those little babies to perfection. And they also sell green coffee beans for those home roasters out there. And right now, fans of the Creep Street Podcast can get 20% off their entire order by using the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Once again, for 20% off your order, use the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Martini Coffee Roasters, the perfect coffee to keep you creeps caffeinated.
You've taken a wrong turn down Creep Street.
Citizens of the Milky Way, this is Maureen Bogey.
And this is Dylan Hackworth.
And you are listening to the Creep Street Podcast.
Congratulations, you've already won.
I mean, truly good for you. God bless. We're happy for you.
Absolutely.
Because this is going to be one hell of a ride.
Oh my God, I cannot wait to get this one going.
Oh my gosh, me too. It's going to be a blast. But before we get to it, a quick reminder that you can follow us on Instagram at Creep Street Podcast, Twitter at Creep Street Pod. We're also on Facebook, and on our Facebook we have a subgroup called Citizens of the Milky Way. Everyone and anyone is welcome to join that, so please check it out.
Oh yeah.
Also, if you're a fan of the show, please like, rate, subscribe, tell a friend, share it on social media, anything like that. These little things really do add up.
Yes.
And we see them, and we're so thankful for all of that.
And by the way, it looks like Spotify just added a rating system.
That's true.
It's real quick. Literally, it takes a second. I don't even think you write reviews.
Yes.
It's just like you put down the star. So just give us one of those 5 stars right there on Spotify now, too, please.
Yes, please. We really would appreciate it. It would mean so much to the Creep Street Homeowners Association and for
Absolutely.
Creep Street's future. And if one episode a week is not enough for you, if you are...
It's not.
It's not. If you're looking for more content, then fear not. We have the cure. We have the goods. It's at patreon.com/creepstreetpodcast.
Oh, yeah.
On Patreon, we have 3 different tiers where you can get all sorts of different bonus content, anywhere from short stories all the way to full bonus episodes.
Oh, yeah.
So we recommend you check that out over at patreon.com/creepstreetpodcast. So last week we had a little bit of fun. We were a little loose goose last week. We were feeling a little jolly.
That's true.
We went for something a little...
Some lighter fare.
Yeah, I was just going to say, is light the right word? I guess so.
I mean, there's still spooky stuff, but like a little more easy to digest.
Exactly. We kind of gave you a quick one and done little shot there.
Right.
Whereas this is a different ball game altogether.
Oh.
A horse of a different color, if you will.
Oh boy, you are correct.
Dylan, what are we talking about today? Tell us.
Today we are talking about the Werewolf of Southend. Yes. Now,
Damn.
real quick, let me just give you all my sources.
Okay.
My main source was a book called Werewolf by none other than Ed and Lorraine Warren,
Whoa.
Bill Ramsey, and Robert David Chase. And then the article Werewolf Demons, The Bizarre Case of the Southend Werewolf by Brent Swanser at Mysterious Universe, and Bill Ramsey, The Southend Werewolf by Les Hewitt at paranormal.com.
Okay.
Now, as you might have gleaned from my sources, this is an Ed and Lorraine Warren joint.
Yes.
I think the last time we did an Ed and Lorraine Warren was The Devil Made Me Do It, like back in the summer.
I think so. So it's been a hot minute.
It's been a hot minute, and boy, oh boy, this case is wild. Now, of course, as you know, this revolves around a werewolf, but it's not a werewolf in the traditional sense. This is more so a story of demonic possession.
Got it.
It's a little bit of werewolf, but also a little bit of devil as well,
Oh,
an exorcism.
God. Oh, no.
Classic Ed and Lorraine Warren stuff.
Spooky.
So buckle up here. Now, like I said, rather than the typical story of someone who transforms by the light of the full moon, this is a possession story. Was Bill Ramsey, this man who this story circles around, was he afflicted by a little understood psychological disorder? Was he really transforming into a wolf? Or had something demonic overtaken him? Now, today's story primarily takes place throughout the 1980s, but we're going to jump back in time just to tell you about some few incidents that brought us here. So as you know, our story revolves around a man named William Ramsey, or Bill, as everyone called him and is what we'll call him. Bill was born on November 11th, 1943. In the same town where the majority of the incidents took place, which is in the English town of Southend-On-Sea, located about 40 miles east of London. Most folks just refer to it simply as Southend. And now, as a young boy growing up in a working-class family, there was nothing that seemed too unique about Bill. Bill began working as a boy, and he worked in a variety of different jobs. Bill's life as a schoolboy was pretty interesting. He seemed to have a hard time focusing on studies. He was very disinterested. He was an active young man, and he'd prefer to either just be out having an adventure or catching a movie, rather than studying and doing homework.
I mean, can you blame him?
Nothing too unordinary there. He attended Hamstell Road Junior School and then later transferred to South Church Hall High School for boys. And while Bill was always having to be reminded to focus, his teachers would tell you he certainly was smart. He was excellent in English and French, and he could wow teachers, especially when he applied himself. And while Bill had no problem making friends and hanging out with others, it's also said he was just as content to play by himself as a boy. One of his favorite things to do was go to the movies. He especially loved American westerns and war films. Often he'd go see a movie and then spend hours in his backyard as a boy pretending to, be a cowboy or things like that.
Classic.
Classic. The first time Bill showed any sign of something strange happened on a sunny Saturday in 1952. It was the summer. He was only at the age of 9. A local cinema had been showing a double feature that day about the Royal Air Force, and Bill was just buzzing about it. He couldn't wait to get outside to play and imagine himself as a jet fighter in World War II. He helped his mother with some chores that needed doing around the house, and then he whisked outside to the backyard to play. He played without stop for over an hour, just buzzing around the backyard, when all of a sudden, as he turned around, he felt a strange sensation within him. It was something he had never felt before, but could still recollect decades later. Bill described the moment, saying,
"Have you ever walked into a meat locker right after you've been outside on a hot day? That's what it was like. I was playing and my body temperature was normal, and then, I'd say it felt as if my body temperature dropped a good 20 degrees. Sweat froze on me, and my whole body started shaking. It was as if I'd opened this door and stepped inside to another dimension or something. And there was this odor, very foul. A few years earlier, a sewer on our street backed up. I've never smelled anything as bad as the gases that escaped, and that's what this smell was like that day. I was afraid I was going to vomit."
Oh, gosh. That is
Yeah.
scary.
So we're getting
and
cold
gross.
chills and stinky smells.
Oh,
we're
come
starting
on.
to see a theme here already.
I was going to say how weird it was that he mentioned the meat locker thing on a hot day, but then I actually have experienced that feeling
Right.
before, and it is great.
Oh,
or
yeah.
not great. Well, great.
But it's a sharp.
It's a sharp situation.
Yeah. After some time, though, the cold sensation and awful smell would fade away a little bit, but there was still this feeling that Bill just couldn't shake. He felt different, almost like he was no longer a child. He tried to continue playing, imagining himself as a World War II fighter pilot, but it all just seemed so silly, like it was something a child would do. And that's when images of a wolf began to flash in his head, and he had this indescribable urge to run away on all fours down to the seaside. Well, some time passed, and Bill stood there silently in the backyard as the sun was setting. From inside, he heard his mother call to him to come inside for dinner. And for whatever reason, when she did this, it sparked in him a rage he had never felt before. As he turned to look at the house, he tripped over a fence post he was standing by and fell to the ground. And this caused Bill to snap. Keep in mind, 9 years old.
Yeah.
As he rose to his feet, he was blinded by an animalistic rage. He felt something like a roar bubbling up inside of him. And turning to the fence post, the 9-year-old Bill Ramsey tore the post from the ground, flinging grass and dirt everywhere.
Oh my God.
Seeing this, his mother ran outside immediately. Now, to further highlight how strange this was, it would have taken at least 3 grown men, maybe more, to be able to pull this fence post from the ground.
Jesus.
And his mother watched as her 9-year-old son did it himself with no trouble at all.
Yikes.
She runs outside and stops in her tracks. There was her son swinging the fence post above his head, growling in a way that seemed impossible for a person to do. The wire fencing that ran from post to post was still attached to the post he was swinging around, and she was terrified he was going to hurt himself on it. She called out to her husband to come quick, which he did, and both of them stood there in stunned disbelief. They slowly approached him, beckoning him to put down the fence post. But just then, the boy grabbed at the wire fencing and began chewing on it like an animal. Blood trickled down his mouth and hands as the wire cut him. The mother, all she could do was sob, and the father grabbed hold of his son, trying to get him on his feet, but he couldn't. The boy had some sort of incredible strength he had never displayed before.
Oh my God, this is so gross.
He let out a fearsome growl, and both parents fled back to the house. As they got to the porch steps, Bill's mother tripped. His father quickly turned and helped his wife to her feet, but as he did, he briefly looked back at his son in the now mostly dark backyard. What he saw, though, wasn't like his boy at all. It almost seemed like a wolf. The parents rush inside and they bolt the door shut. For a few minutes, they couldn't really make out where their son was as it had gotten so dark outside. But after a few moments, that strange cold and awful smell subsided and Bill was seemingly back to normal. However, he couldn't remember what had just happened. But judging by the state of the fence and the blood all over him, he figured it wasn't something good.
Oh, God.
The 9-year-old Bill walked up to the house and knocked on the door to be let in. His parents were still horrified, but obviously couldn't just let their boy they loved just stay outside. Cautiously, they opened the door and Bill ran to their arms. The family comforted each other, and they wouldn't speak of that night ever again.
What?
And in fact, that very night, Bill's mother served the family dinner, and even then she noticed it seemed like Bill was no longer the boy he once was. He looked different.
I mean, after an experience like that, damn. That'll change you. Chewing on some wire will change you.
Yeah, like a caged animal.
Oh, God.
Believe it or not, the family was spared any further incidents. Life was actually pretty normal for Bill and his family as he grew up. He left high school in 1958, a couple years before graduating. And from childhood on to an adulthood, Bill was known to be, a little shy and self-conscious. Bill was one of 8 children in a poor family, and he often felt lonely and overlooked. Apparently, the family's poverty was so severe that one of Bill's older sisters had even had to be adopted by another family as a way of sort of easing the economic burden, but...
Oof, that is dark.
Yeah. Becoming an adult, Bill worked various jobs until he discovered he had a special talent for carpentry. He apparently just had a special touch for it. Not only did this prove to be financially prosperous for him, it in turn gave him more self-confidence. In 1965, he would marry his wife, Nina, and in almost no time, the couple had 3 children. Now, just to be clear real quick, my main source said the wife's name was Abby, but I believe that was done just to protect her identity. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure her real name was Nina.
Okay.
So I'm just going to call her Nina.
Neens.
Well, it wasn't long after settling down and starting a family that Bill began to be plagued by awful nightmares. The dream that played out in his head went like this. It would be a beautiful sunny morning, and Bill would enter the kitchen to find his wife at the sink doing something, whether it was cleaning dishes or making breakfast or whatever. He would call out her name, and she would turn to look at him with a smile on her face. And also, by the way, this seemed to be playing out in slow motion as well. But as her eyes gazed upon him, her smile turned into a look of absolute terror. Covering her eyes with her hands, she screamed loudly, so loudly, in fact, that it would cause Bill to run from the kitchen. He couldn't be sure, but judging by the look on her face, it seemed as though in his dream, Bill had transformed into a monster. Something so hideous his wife couldn't even bear to look at him. The dream would come to him often throughout the mid-60s. On many occasions, both he and his wife would be awakened by his restless thrashing and shouting in his sleep. He would wake up in a cold sweat, but the dream was always the same. What was it his wife was seeing that was so awful? Yet despite his concern, Bill never told his wife about the dream. Not now, at least. Strangely enough, sometime during the summer of 1967, the dream abruptly stopped and Bill was actually able to sleep peacefully for about a year and a half. During that year and a half, the family was quite happy. Work had been pretty good, and the family was even able to put a little money aside as savings. The next strange occurrence happened during a blizzard late one night in the winter of 68-69. Bill awoke with a start and looked over to see his wife was still fast asleep. It was strange that he woke up in such a way because he hadn't been dreaming as far as he could remember. And that's when Bill heard it, a low rumble of a growl coming from somewhere in the room.
Oh no.
At first, Bill couldn't believe it. Surely he was just half asleep and he was just kind of having a lucid dream of some kind. And his mind was just playing games, but then he heard it again. And it was unmistakable. The low, deep growl of a huge animal. The room was dark and Bill was frozen with fear. He gazed into the dark corner of the room, afraid something was crouching in the dark. But when he heard the growl again, Bill realized that the sound wasn't coming from somewhere in the room, it was coming from him. In his mind, he remembered the dream of his wife turning to look at him in horror. The moments passed, and eventually the growling faded away.
Oh God, that is so scary. At first, it kind of reminded me of in Hellfire Farm.
Yeah,
where she's hearing the growling.
Oh, that's right. That's absolutely right. Mm-hmm. Now, after that strange incident, Bill and his family were once again left alone for several years. And from what I can tell from my sources, the years that followed, leading up until the early 80s, were actually pretty good for the family. It sounds like it was a good time. They were in love, they were raising their kids, and they had always found a way to make ends meet even when times did get tough economically. Now, skipping forward ahead to 1983, and the economy is going through a bit of a recession. There wasn't as much carpentry work to go around, so as a way to sort of make a little extra money, Bill had assembled a small office cleaning business with some associates of his. Now, once again, in my main source, it says these friends were named Jeremy Wright and Scott Burnsnell. I'm assuming maybe these were aliases they made for the story, but I could be wrong, but I'm just going to refer to them as Jeremy and Scott.
Okay.
So Jeremy and Scott, they're friends of Bill's who were hard workers, very reliable, and he knew he could depend on them. For certain jobs that included painting, he would have Jeremy and Scott help out. Well, during this time, another thing that was happening, Bill found himself being inexplicably drawn to the moon every night. It felt like it was almost calling to him. He would lose hours just staring up at the moon. Sometimes Nina would wake up to see Bill standing at the window, staring up at the moon. And recently, one of their jobs that Bill was on with Jeremy and Scott, where they were painting a house that was out in the moors, and they, put in many late nights out there, and Bill would often just lose track of time staring up at the moon. Well, it was autumn of 1983, and his companions were working one such job out in the moors. They wrapped up their work for the day, and the three of them decided, hey, they're going to grab some beers on the way home.
Oh, come on, having a good time.
One of them always tempered their drinking on these nights, so they would always have a sober driver.
Oh, very good.
Tonight, Scott was going to be the designated driver. So while they're there drinking, Bill began to feel unwell. He excused himself to the restroom, and when he looked into the bathroom mirror, what he saw looking back at him was a wolf.
What?
Bill didn't know what to make of it. He returned to his friends just saying he felt unwell and that he was ready to go home. So Scott drove. Sitting next to Scott in the passenger seat was a bunch of their painting supplies, so Jeremy and Bill sat in the back. Now, sometime during this drive back, Bill began to feel that icy cold chill that usually came right before one of his episodes.
Oh, no.
Starting in his belly and rising up into this chest began this rumble of rage. Strange growling sounds began to emanate from Bill, and before anyone was aware of what was happening, Bill lunged at Jeremy. Jeremy did what he could to fight back, and he quickly realized that Bill was not kidding, and he was in a serious altercation. Bill was growling like an animal and his hands were curled up like claws. Jeremy unleashed punches and elbows and even a headbutt in order to stop Bill, but nothing seemed to work. And then Bill made an attempt to sink his teeth into Jeremy's leg.
Oh my God.
Jeremy is screaming to Scott for help, who's also shouting at Bill to stop. Quickly, he pulled the car over to the side of the road and helped Jeremy pin Bill against the inside of the car door. It took all their strength. And in the dark of the car, they noticed that Bill looked different. He looked like an animal. In all, the attack lasted about 5 minutes, and they watched as the strange look in Bill's eyes began to dissipate, and that inhuman growl turned into almost a whimper. His lips that had been curled back, showing his teeth, went back to normal, and now Bill had a look of sadness and confusion in his eyes. He screamed for them to let him go and let him out of the car, which he quickly did. He knew something had just happened, but he couldn't remember what. Essentially, Bill was able to play it off the next day, saying he was just trying to freak the guys out, and they kind of didn't believe him, but they just accepted it.
Right.
Well, the next major incident would come a few months later on December 5th of 1983. Bill had recently found additional work at a local taxi cab company. He wasn't a driver, but he was a dispatcher, and he was actually surprised to find out how much he enjoyed the work. Part of what Bill enjoyed about it was all the people he would meet. Folks from all walks of life. People who needed a cab called in, and Bill would relay their request for a taxi to one of their drivers. Now, some of the stories the cabbies would come back with about their experiences were just mind-boggling, and Bill enjoyed that part of his position. He got to hear all about all these wacky things without actually having to experience them himself. Well, it was the night of December 5th, and Bill was on his usual drive home when he started to feel a sharp pain in his chest.
Oh,
He quickly began to have trouble breathing as well, and Bill pulled the car over to the side of the road to try and catch his breath, but the pain only got worse. Bill was now afraid that he was in the middle of a heart attack, so he got back in his car and he drove directly to Southend General Hospital. Right as he got out of the car, another sharp pain hit his chest, causing him to fall up against the car door. It took all of Bill's strength, but he was able to enter the emergency room. And as he did, he began to feel those familiar cold chills that would come just before one of his wolf episodes. Immediately, he was greeted by nurses in the lobby who helped him onto a gurney and wheeled him down to an open room. Bill was given a blanket as he was cold, and a nurse took his blood pressure. It was then that Bill felt that inhuman growl start to grow in his belly and up to his chest. His hands took on the look of claws, and his lips peeled back to reveal his teeth. He swiped at the nurse, who was actually able to dodge his strike, and then with a roar, Bill grabbed the other nurse's arm and sunk his teeth into it just below the elbow. Both nurses were screaming and hitting him, but Bill's vice-like bite grip would not let go. Blood trickled down her arm and his face. The nurses began to scream out for help as Bill now began to throw furniture around the room. Luckily, at the hospital that night was a young police officer who had only been on the job for 6 months. Strangely enough, that very night before starting his shift, that same officer had been troubled by a dream he had that prior evening that seemed to almost be a premonition of death.
Oh, what?
His wife actually asked him to call in that night, but he didn't. Suddenly now, this premonition he had didn't seem so silly as it first did. An intern there that night grabbed the officer, and the two rushed down to where all this commotion was going on. Immediately, when the officer laid eyes on Bill, the first thing that popped into his head was how animal-like this man seemed. After getting knocked around a bit, the intern was actually able to get Bill's arm in a sort of hammerlock, which allowed the officer to get Bill on a gurney, and the two of them quickly strapped Bill down, and a doctor administered a large shot of Thorazine to knock him out. The next thing Bill knew, he was waking up at Runewell Mental Hospital. Doctors filled him in on what had happened the night previous, and despite their strong recommendations that Bill stay for further evaluation, he decided to leave. He was afraid of what people would think, knowing that he had been admitted to a mental hospital. Now, the wolf would return the very next month, January of 1984.
Damn, so it's really picking up.
It's really picking up, and what you're going to notice, every time it happens, he gets stronger.
Right.
Bill's mother was a widow, and often he would go visit her. They liked to chat about the old days and whatnot, as you do when you visit. Well, one evening after paying his mother a visit, Bill was on that same drive home when he was once again beset by those too familiar cold chills. Bill tried to fight that rage boiling up within him as an image of Wolf flashed in his eyes. Knowing full well what was about to happen, Bill drove as quickly as he could to the hospital again. However, by the time Bill got to the lobby of the emergency room, he had already been overcome.
Please, help me,
grunted Bill, with what was still left of Bill in him. And the nurse asked him to just take a seat, but Bill tried with all his might to tell her that something was awfully wrong and something bad was about to happen.
Oh, no.
But the nurse, like you probably would, just assumed the guy was probably a little nuts, a little drunk or something, came in wandering off the street. But it was too late. The wolf had taken over. With one lightning-quick, vicious strike, Bill launched the nurse across the room, sending her crashing into a row of chairs. 2 male patients happened to be there getting treated, and they saw what happened, and they came running up the hall to her aid. Unfortunately, these 2 men were no match for Bill. Bill sent one flying into those same chairs where the nurse was, and the other one went up and onto the reception desk. While Bill was knocking around these 2 guys like matchsticks, the first nurse who got thrown had managed to make her way over to a wall phone where she called for help. Bill took off on a rampage, running deeper into the hospital, tearing up the place as he went. It didn't matter what was in front of him, chairs, tables, gurneys, even people. He was like a steamroller. Bill just threw things aside like trash, like a beast as he went. A doctor carrying a clipboard just happened to step out of a room where he was, I'm assuming, treating a patient or something. He happened to see Bill rushing toward him, and in a flash, that doctor was picked up by the shoulders, at least a foot off the ground, and tossed aside like a ball.
Wow.
It was about then that alarms went off and police were called. Not ceasing his rampage, Bill continued tearing through the hospital, leaving debris in his wake. He went down into the basement of the hospital where he tore shit up for a few minutes and then ran back upstairs. When police found Bill, he had an intern by the throat, seemingly choking him with the intent to kill. 4 officers burst through the door and Bill immediately dropped the intern to face them. The 4 officers kind of got in a semicircle around Bill, clubs already in hand. They made their move, grabbing onto Bill around his neck, his waist, arms, legs, etc. But Bill was able to get a hold of one of the officers and threw him down so violently to the ground that the officer was hospitalized for the next 4 days.
Wow.
So you gotta think he broke something or something.
4 days. Damn.
Finally, after repeatedly hitting Bill with their clubs and fists and feet, they were able to subdue him and put some cuffs on him. And in a few moments, the rage subsided and Bill realized to his horror that it had happened again. Bill was taken to the local jail where he was held for a little while. After some time, Bill was sat down with the police surgeon, who explained to him what had happened when it became clear Bill did not remember. And it wasn't like he was pretending he didn't remember.
Right, he
could
genuinely
tell. Right.
Could not recall, yeah.
Bill really, truly could not remember. Shockingly, the police surgeon gave Bill the choice of checking into Runewell Mental Hospital or being released and sent home. Of course, Bill chose to go home as he was, as we know, afraid of the stigma of staying at a mental institution. But the police surgeon said, okay, you can go home, but if this happens again, and believe me, it will, you're not going to have a choice next time. You're going to Runewell Mental Hospital. Mm-hmm. Now, my thing was like, where's that line between well, this guy needs mental health, and also, should he just be in jail because he assaulted?
Because he assaulted all of those people.
Right. I mean, obviously, if he was, you don't want to, further demonize someone if they're...
But you also don't want to just, let them go.
Yeah,
it just
right.
seems kind of odd.
You would think he would need to be held in some way, especially after that episode.
Right.
Just from, property damage.
Right.
And let alone, the actual physical assault.
I was wondering about that, too, because it's I understand that this is out of his control, but at the same time, it's the people that are getting absolutely destroyed by this man.
Exactly.
Maybe, you know what, that's just weird. It's complicated and weird.
Now, this next part is one of the stranger parts. So now we're jumping forward a little bit to the summer of 1987. keep in mind, this was January of 84 when Bill had this episode. So Bill, and this is the other thing, sometimes it'll happen, and then sometimes he'll be given a break for a while.
Right. Weird. What the fuck?
Wildly enough, Bill had not had one of his episodes since that hospital rampage. In fact, the constant fear he felt of this thing flaring up was even fading away, and life seemed to kind of be getting more normal day by day. The economy had once again taken a slight dip, and Bill had picked up some extra work, working as a repairman for a block of apartments in the town of Hornchurch. Now, despite this need to work more, Bill and Nina were apparently quite happy at this time, and it seemed like those strange days may very well be behind them. But it was the evening of July 22nd, 1987, and Bill was driving the company van home from work that day to drop off some co-workers. Feeling a little spontaneous, Bill decided he was going to stop and have a drink at a place called the White Horse Inn. Well, Bill got a bit carried away. He saw some old friends, they had a good time. He drank a bit more than he intended. Well, now he was kind of worried about getting stopped by police. So he decided to take an alternate route home that was a bit more isolated, less cars and stuff, but this route also happened to take him right through the heart of the red light district. Well, walking the streets of the red light district that night was an underage prostitute that my source says her name was Lauren Reynolds, which I'm certain was probably an alias, but we'll just call her Lauren for the purpose of this story. Now, at the time of the interview, like in the book, it says she's 19 at the time of the interview. Mm-hmm. And the book even says, quote, looking back at her 2-year drift into prostitution. So I'm guessing that means she was a teenager of some kind, like
right.
Clearly was underage. That's the point, is it was underage. They don't specify how young she was when this happened, but
right.
You know, we can assume it was younger than 19.
Oh, yikes. That's very sad.
Well, Bill's driving through the red light district when he spots Lauren walking down the sidewalk. He suddenly had this idea that he was going to invite her into the van before announcing that he was making a citizen's arrest and taking her to the police station. Here's an excerpt from my source quoting Lauren as she describes that encounter much differently than Bill did.
I was walking along the street. It was late and dark, and that always makes me nervous. When I sensed a car cruising along slowly behind me, I turned and saw this van. I could barely make out the man's face. I wondered if he was looking for a woman, but somehow I didn't think so. Not cruising the way he was. He seemed to have something else in mind. You can imagine what it was like. The van staying right on my heels, as it were, and the man inside staring at me. I wondered about running, but then I realized that he could easily hop out of the van and come after me. I kept hoping to see a policeman. A lot of the girls don't especially like cops, but I do. Despite what I choose to do, I've always found policemen very protective and courteous. I wanted to get to the station and feel protected. Then the van surged ahead of me and pulled over to the curb. I didn't know what to do. Maybe this was a man cruising for women after all. Something harmless. I started toward the van. He leaned over and pushed the door open for me. He was a nice-looking man until you watched his eyes. There was something crazed about them. I don't know how else to describe them. He asked me to get into the car. I knew I didn't want to. I turned and started to walk away, but he called me back. Reluctantly, I went.
So she, for a little, in the book, she kind of, it's hard to describe. She got this uneasy feeling, but then thought, oh, well, maybe he's just...
Right.
Because he says, he doesn't say, I want sex. He kind of implies how you would, like he plays coy, like,
right.
What are you looking for tonight? And he's like, I think, smile. My thing is just like, what do you mean you thought you were going to make a citizen's arrest? Like, granted, yes,
what
underage,
are you
that's
talking
awful.
about?
And that girl should be saved from her situation, but like, it's hard for like a man in a van to like, it's hard to make that, it just looks suspicious anyway.
And also like making a citizen's arrest, like, why don't you just help her instead of taking her to the police where, it's like,
exactly.
What are you that I don't believe that.
Well, Lauren awkwardly chatted with Bill and got into the van assuming he was just going to be a customer. But once they began to drive, for the first 3 blocks there was only silence. And that's when Bill told her he was making a citizen's arrest and taking her to the police station. In actuality, Lauren was kind of relieved to hear that they were headed toward a police station, as she was feeling very uneasy. She started to realize he wasn't there for just sex. There was something else he was there for. They pulled into the police station, but Lauren had this sneaking suspicion that he wasn't intending to actually let her go. Slowly, she put her hand on the door handle and opened the door, not taking her eyes off of him. She looked away for a brief moment, making sure her foot touched the pavement, and when she looked back, though, Bill had an almost animalistic glare on his face. She jumped out of the car just as he lunged to grab her, but she was able to get out of the car. She took off running into the station entrance, and inside, Bill sat there, and he could feel that monstrous growl building up inside of him. Now, inside of the station that night was a 25-year police veteran named Brad Bubsy. Lauren ran up to him and some of the other officers there and frantically tried to explain this strange man in the van outside that she needed protection from. She was really scared, and apparently Officer Bubsy said in interviews later that it was kind of hard to understand what she was saying because she was clearly in distress, and they were trying to follow, what she was saying. So Bubsy just told her everything would be fine and to just stay in the station with the other officers, and he would go out and have a look at this strange man for himself. So Bubsy heads outside, and the first thing he notices is the ruckus coming from the precinct's kennel where they kept all the officer dogs. They were going nuts, howling and growling. And it didn't take long till Bubsy found this van in question. It was parked. And standing beside it was the strange silhouette of a man, but in the shadows, this man looked more like a beast. He stood absolutely still. And at first, Bubsy thought maybe the man was just really drunk. He called out to him, "Excuse me," but got no response. He slowly approached closer and closer, asking him questions, but getting no response. He finally got one response, though, when he asked his name.
Bill Ramsey.
And that was the only response he got. Talking and moving gently, the officer touched Bill on the elbow, attempting to sort of gently guide him towards the station entrance. But Bill jerked away. And when he tried again, Bill lunged at him. Officer Bubsy was immediately taken off guard by the sheer strength of this man. Now, keep in mind, I forgot to say up top, I want to say Bill was only about 5'7" and like 100 and I can't remember what it was. It was under 200 pounds.
Wow, yeah.
Not a giant guy.
Pretty slight.
Once again, this is a 25-year police veteran who's wrestled many a drunk to the ground in his career. But this was different. Just as a normal person would lose endurance the longer a fight went, Bill only grew stronger. Bill's hands clasped around Bubsy's throat. And likewise, Bubsy grabbed Bill by the throat, but it was no use. He could feel himself losing consciousness. And under the lights outside the station, Bubsy was able to get an awful glimpse at Bill's face. He looked like an animal, his eyes wide with a grin unnaturally large across his face. And that's when Bill said to the officer,
"When the devil's in me, I'm strong."
And he kept repeating that over and over, almost like a chant. And just then, another group of officers came running to Bubsy's aid. 2 of them were able to pull Bubsy away from Bill and make sure that Bubsy was okay, while another group of 6 tried to subdue Bill. 6 officers attempted to pin Bill to the ground so that the police surgeon could administer a shot of Thorazine to knock him out. This proved futile, though, as Bill was able to manhandle all 6 police officers.
Wow.
And behind them, while this is going on, the dogs in their kennel are going nuts. The dogs are freaking out. It's as if they can sense evil outside. Seeing as they're still getting whooped, the surgeon called for more backup and 6 additional officers came running. In all, it took 12 officers in total to hold Bill down.
12.
So that he could get a shot of Thorazine. After which they led him to a holding cell, but the moment he was in the cell, he went wild again. The sedative didn't work. This was what was truly horrifying to these men. Police they had to pin him down in the cell with pillows so they couldn't get bitten, on their arms and stuff.
Right.
The surgeon administered a second shot, which seemed to throw Bill into almost like a seizure-like state. His body was shaking and he was growling. It was like he was fighting the effects of the sedative. Even after the second shot, it took 10 minutes until Bill was finally subdued. Everyone there was in shock at the awful sounds he made, like a beast, not a man. In fact, it was this specific incident where the name Werewolf of Southend came up. Some of the officers that night felt they had encountered a real-life werewolf. And about 2 hours later, Bill would awaken to find himself at Runewell Mental Hospital. Now, before we continue on, I wanted to share with you this interview that was conducted by Ed Lorraine Warren with Officer Brad Bubsy about his encounter that night. Mo will be Ed and Lorraine Warren, and I'll be Officer Bubsy.
You retired after that night with Bill Ramsey. Would you tell us why?
The damage.
Physical damage?
Not physical. I mean, I was hurt, but I'd been hurt before in the line of duty. No, I mean the psychological damage.
So Ramsey had a lasting effect on you?
Absolutely. I still have nightmares about it.
You're such a big, strapping man, and Bill Ramsey's so small.
He wasn't small that night, believe me. Not in strength, anyway. I'm told that he held off as many as 12 men at a time for a bit. So it doesn't matter how small in physical stature he is, he more than made up for it with his rage. I've never seen a man like that.
And he tried to kill you?
Oh yes, definitely. No doubt about that. All you had to do was take one look at his eyes.
So after the incident, you retired?
Yes. I couldn't see going on as an officer anymore. Ramsey took something essential out of me.
Have you seen Ramsey since?
No.
What would happen if you did?
I'm not sure, but I suppose that even if he looked nice and normal, I'd still be thinking about that night. I'm not sure I could look him in the eyes either. Not even now.
Damn, so Ramsey really made an impression.
He did. I mean, this man who was a 25-year police veteran retired after this encounter with Bill Ramsey.
Woof.
Well, the police surgeon, as we know, was true to his word, and Bill was immediately admitted into Runewell under the Mental Health Act. Now, according to my source, part of the Mental Health Act specifies that a person can be held up to 28 days in a mental hospital if a police surgeon orders it so. Keep in mind, this is 1987, so I don't know if the rules are the same or whatnot, but at the time, them's was the rules. Bill would stay at Runewell for a total of 10 days until he was released, and he hated every second of it, and he just wanted to be home with his family. Yet even after countless brain scans, x-rays, and psychological evaluations, there was nothing doctors could find that would indicate what was happening to Bill. They did seem to think that Bill was an alcoholic, though, and Bill actually agreed with them. They thought perhaps these episodes were brought about by his drinking, but Bill had had these episodes while also stone cold sober as well.
Right, and being drunk wouldn't make you fill up with that much strength. If anything, I feel like if you're that drunk, you wouldn't be able to be as strong.
Right. And it's the case is even if this drinking did bring it out in him, he still did it when he was sober too. So
right. True.
Right. And Bill was really worried now. He was afraid that if these attacks didn't stop, he would have no other choice but to resort to suicide to protect his family. Now, enter the Warrens.
Oh, come on, here they are. Let's do it, baby.
Wouldn't you know it, sometime later in 1989, the Warrens happened to be in London while on vacation in England. The trip was sort of a half vacation, half work. While they had planned lots of sightseeing and catching up with friends, they were also investigating a particular case that was happening out on the moors. They were in their hotel that morning in London, and Ed was in the bathroom shaving, and Lorraine was in the living room putting in her earrings, and playing on the TV was a program called Incredible Sunday. And they happened to be running a story that day about the very strange case of the Southend werewolf. As Lorraine listened to Bill's story, she became more and more convinced that this was a case of demonic possession. Funny enough, just 2 nights earlier, before the couple had flown to England, Lorraine had just happened to open one of her occult books to a chapter about werewolves. She had never read up much on the lore, and she became fascinated by it. How funny that 2 days later, Bill would pop up on her TV. The both of them, Ed and Lorraine, were taken by Bill's story and were convinced that what was plaguing Bill was no medical situation, but a spiritual one. And while they continued their work in the moors, Lorraine made a series of phone calls to the Southend Police Department trying to arrange a meeting with Bill Ramsey. Now, when the Ramseys first heard that the Warrens were interested in helping them, they happily accepted, as they had truly exhausted every other option. Yet, even despite everything they had been through, Bill thought the idea of exorcism was ridiculous. Meeting with the Ramseys, the Warrens offered to fly Bill and Nina over to the States for an exorcism, and that they would pay for all their travel and lodging. After a few days of thinking it over, the Ramseys decided it was worth a shot. In fact, they had always dreamed of visiting the United States, and that was just sort of an added bonus.
Yeah, kind of an ideal situation.
Absolutely. Ed told Bill to expect a call from him within the next 2 weeks. First, he had to get everything arranged. And boy, did he ever. Not only would Bill and his wife be flying over, but a reporter and a photographer from People magazine as well. Now, according to one of my sources, and I couldn't find another one to reaffirm this, but it said that Bill was paid upwards of $20,000 for the exclusive rights to his story. I have no way of confirming that. Also, during the time Bill was waiting for the phone call from Ed, some interesting developments were taking place. Bill had been having some strange episodes where he would growl in his sleep, but when Nina would wrap her arms around him and tell him that she loved him, this seemed to actually dispel the attacks before they would fully manifest.
Oh, that's cute.
Despite some fear that the exorcism wouldn't work, the couple was truly optimistic for the first time in years. They made the flight over to the States, flying into New York City. And of course, they were immediately swept up in the grandeur of the old United States. Obviously, New York was wild, but even out in the countryside, the couple just noted that things just seemed bigger and more exciting in the US of A.
Oh, baby.
Well, word was getting around in the small New England communities of Connecticut that a man who was supposedly a werewolf had come to the States at the invitation of the Warrens to be exorcised. Folks in and around Monroe, Connecticut, where the Warrens lived, were fascinated, and while at a diner in a nearby town, a local reporter from a small county newspaper got wind of the story. Now, a story about a werewolf and an exorcism would certainly be a hot story in the sleepy countryside of Connecticut. And just to clarify, my source names the reporter as Chuck Vogel, so I'm going to call him Chuck, but just as always, this might have been, an alias.
Right.
So. He found out that one Father Robert Bishop was going to be conducting the rite of exorcism at his church. Something unique to note about Father Bishop is that he was what is known as a traditionalist Catholic, and that he still performed all masses and rites in original Latin. Now, the night before the exorcism was to take place, Chuck had the idea that he would arrive at the church early and hide somewhere within the sanctuary where he would observe the ceremony and take photos. Little did he know, he was in for one hell of an experience. Now, that same night before the exorcism, Nina came the closest to her worst nightmare. She was awakened in the night by a deep, monstrous growl. When she looked over at her husband, he was no longer Bill, but the wolf. She described his eyes as being the color of blood-red rubies. He looked up at her with his lips peeled back, revealing his fangs. After a struggle, Bill was on top of Nina with his hands around her throat. Nina's life flashed before her eyes, and she did all she could to remain conscious. Using what was left of her strength, she took the heel of her palm and gave Bill a sharp strike to the face that caused him to briefly release his grip. Nina rolled out of bed and onto the floor. Getting up, she backed against the corner of the room and called out to her husband in an attempt to conjure her loving husband from within the beast. In a flash, Bill was on all fours and racing toward her. When she shouted, "I love you, Bill," he stopped dead in his tracks. She kept saying it and watched as his eyes began to change in tone. It was as if the real Bill was fighting the beast from within inside. As she kept repeating those words, Bill's body slunk to the floor, covered in a cold sweat. She wrapped her arms around him until he fell unconscious. In the morning, when Bill awoke, he had no recollection of what had happened the night before, and Nina did not plan to tell him until after the exorcism. But when Bill saw one of the chairs in the room had a broken leg, he knew in the pit of his stomach that something had happened. That same morning, Chuck Vogel, the journalist, awoke with a bit of a hangover after indulging in a bit of whiskey the night before.
Oh, come on.
He faintly remembered having a dream of some kind, but it quickly was gone from his memory. He got out of bed and stumbled to the bathroom to get ready for the day. He turned the sink on and lathered up his face for a shave when, looking into the mirror, he saw something that made him jump back. There was something in the middle of his forehead, some kind of a mark that hadn't been there when he went to bed the night before. Leaning in closer into the mirror, he realized with shock and confusion that the mark on the center of his forehead was a small pentagram.
Oh my God, what the hell?
He was awestruck. When and how the heck did this happen? Using his finger, he rubbed at it, trying to rub it away, as if it was maybe done with a marker or something, but when that didn't work, he even used hot water and soap, but the thing wouldn't go away. It was almost like it had been burned into his head like a brand during the night. Now keep in mind, the town where Chuck lived was very small. He didn't want word getting around, but he knew he needed help. He looked up a church that was about 50 miles from town, and he got in his car and he drove straight over there, hoping to get some answers. In his car mirrors, he could see the mark on his forehead. He got to the church and went inside, where he found a cleaning lady. He asked if the Monsignor was there, and the lady said he was and that she would go fetch him. Within a few minutes, Chuck was sitting in the church's library with Monsignor McBride. He quickly caught him up to speed about why he was there. He was a reporter, and supposedly a guy from England who thought he was a werewolf had flown to the States to see the Warrens and to have an exorcism conducted. He explained that when he woke up that morning with the strange mark, he didn't know who to turn to for help. Well, Monsignor McBride sat there quietly and listened to the man's story. After taking it all in, McBride asked if he could close the library door to ensure that they were talking in private, and Chuck said that was fine. After closing the door, McBride said he certainly believed his story, but informed him that he saw no mark on his head. Chuck was like, "What? Really?" He even got real close to the Monsignor so he could get a good look, and he assured him that there was no mark that he could see.
What the fuck?
Chuck asked if the lady could fetch a hand mirror, which she did. Looking into the mirror, Chuck could plainly see the pentagram in the middle of his head. And judging by the look on Chuck's face, the Monsignor could tell that Chuck could see it too, even if he couldn't see it himself. While Chuck was surprised, McBride was not. He explained that this was obviously a sign that whatever force that was a hold of Bill Ramsey, it did not want Chuck there taking photos and snooping around. He explained to Chuck that he should take this as a sign to stay away from the church. But this was his shot at a Pulitzer. Being a journalist, Chuck had a natural repulsion to any kind of censorship, even if it was coming from supernatural forces. That's when the Monsignor asked him if he had had any strange dreams the night before. At first, Chuck had completely forgotten about the dream he had had the night previous, but then he remembered right as he woke up that morning, being able to remember something. He thought for a few moments until it came back to him. Yes, he had had a weird dream. Chuck described the dream to the Monsignor, saying that in the dream he sensed he was being chased by a beautiful woman, which was odd because why would he be afraid of a beautiful woman? But when he turned to face her, he realized that this was no specimen of beauty. The woman looked almost like a rotting corpse with open, oozing wounds. The way the sources describe her almost makes me think of the old woman in The Shining in the bathtub, sort of like that.
I was thinking that too.
Well, after ending his visit to Monsignor McBride once again warned him not to go anywhere near that church, and that come tomorrow the mark would be gone. Chuck said he would do just that, but on the drive home, though, Chuck found himself still driven to go there. It was his journalistic instinct. Despite his better judgment, Chuck drove to the church and parked. Taking a deep breath, Chuck got out of the car and entered the church. No one was there yet. The lights were all turned off, and the only light really entering the church was through the stained glass windows. But everything looked as it should in a typical Catholic church: rows of pews, the altar, confession booths, etc. That's when Chuck had a feeling in his stomach, telling him he should never have come here. And suddenly the church grew very dark, almost like as if it had become nighttime outside. And this was like midday.
Wow.
Hearing a noise, he turned around toward the confession booths and was greeted by a horrible sight. Coming out of one of the confessionals was the monstrous woman from his dreams. The woman looked like she had come straight from the grave, open sores and rotting flesh. Her eyes were a glowing blood red, and he stood in horror as she walked up the center aisle towards him. Chuck turned and ran full tilt out of the church and to his car. He sped all the way home and locked his doors. That night he sat watching the door with the football game playing. Next to him was a bottle of whiskey and a loaded .38 handgun. As the night went on, he felt better, and he thanked God for getting him home safely. And just as the Monsignor said, the mark was gone the next day.
Wow.
So it was telling him, fuck off.
That is absolutely crazy.
Well, the exorcism started off kind of uneventful. There were 4 armed police officers there with tasers to ensure the bishop's safety. And after about 20 to 30 minutes, nothing had really happened. And Bill was convinced it wouldn't work, but when the bishop began to actually lay the cross on him with holy water, things went wild. But after time, it worked apparently.
Really?
Bill was completely exorcised. According to the story, the family was no longer bothered from that day on.
Wow. What a wild story. So just the exorcism went over well.
Yeah.
You know, like you said, at first it was kind of low key.
Right.
Then it kind of amped up, got a little high key. And then it worked.
Right. Now, the exorcism, I didn't go into, he had to be restrained a little bit. I would have gone into more detail if it would have gotten real.
Right.
Like, there was he growled and shit. But, like, I guess in terms of exorcisms, it sounds like it went very well.
Wow. What a fascinating story.
Absolutely. How strange. The weirdest part for me is picking up that prostitute. Like, what do you mean you're going to make a citizen's arrest?
What was that? That was very weird.
Almost like power trip in a way.
Yeah, I don't know. That was bizarre. There were so many weird twists and turns in this story. I mean, please let us know what you guys think. Do you think that this was a case of demonic possession? Was this a full-on werewolf? Was this something in between? I don't know. Also, keep in mind, my main source was from Ed Lorraine Warren's own story. Right.
And of course, if anyone's going to be biased towards Ed and Lorraine, it's Ed and Lorraine.
Right. That's
Not
right.
say, and as we know, we've said before, some people believe every word Ed and Lorraine say. Some people think they were frauds. Who knows? We haven't done our own research into them specifically. We've researched their cases. But
Right.
That'll be something we do in the future. So obviously take a lot of this with a grain of salt. Now, we do know a lot of this did happen.
Yes.
But in terms of the more cinematic aspects of it, the more, who knows?
Who knows?
But interesting stuff.
Let us know what you all think. And Dylan, thank you so much for doing all of that fantastic research. We so appreciate it. What a great episode.
Well, you know what I forgot to do at the beginning of the episode? We have an addition to our usual shout-outs we have a special one-time shout-out.
Yes, we're so happy to do this.
We got a special one-time shout-out to a new subscriber of our Patreon. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for the serial thriller, Sam Hackworth.
Yes, Sam, thank you so much for joining us. We love you so much, buddy, and we're so happy to have you here.
Sam, my cousin, recently just got engaged, so congratulations to him and his fiancée, Angela.
Yes, big congratulations to you. The whole Creep Street Homeowners Association is out here wishing you all the best. So thank you so much for being a part of our community here.
Now let's hear from those top-tier Patreon subscribers.
Please.
Of course, the Dream James Watkins, the Finnish-faced Via Lundqvist, the Madman Marcus Hall, the Vivacious Vicky McHugh, the Tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid Chris Hackworth, the Oh-So-Suave Sean Richardson, the British Bonebreaker Bex Martin, the Notorious Nicholas Barker, the Terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude Adam Archer, the Sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare of New Zealand Noeline Vivilli, the Loathsome Johnny Love, the Carnivorous Kevin Bogey, the Killer Stud Carl Staub, the Firestarter Heather Carter, the Conqueror Christopher Damian Damaris, and the Awfully Awesome Annie.
Yes. Thank you so much to all of our top tier Patreon subscribers, as well as all of our Patreon subscribers, and all of you for listening. If you want to be like those fierce names we just listed off, please check out patreon.com/creepstreetpodcast for more bonus content.
Once again, like, rate, subscribe, all those goodies. Remember, Spotify now can rate, so go do it there as well.
It means the world. Thank
you, everyone, and Happy New Year. I forgot this is coming out on New Year's Eve.
That's right.
To all of our Creep Street homies.
We love you.
Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
I'm Maureen Bogey.
Good night and goodbye.
Goodbye.